Good afternoon, you all, and good morning to Professor Nicola Petrovic. And most welcome to the Center for Digital Education and Professional Development, University of Jayewardenepura, Sri Lanka, because the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences established a separate unit on ethical studies under the Center for Digital Education and Professional Development. For the objective of this center is to develop the ethical reasoning of our graduates as well the academics. So, and I'm very happy to say thanks to the Professor Nicola Petrovic because he accepted my invitation. Now, I would like to invite to our Dean, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Sriranta Heenkende, to welcome to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Asha. As you mentioned, we established our Center for Digital Education and Professional Development in the faculty for enhancement of the research and the professional behavior of the student. Yeah, Dr. Asha, yeah, please start the.
Okay, sir. I'm warmly welcome to Professor Nicola Petrovic. He's from the Department of Psychology, the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Belgrade in Serbia. And his research interests are based on the psychotherapy, crisis intervention, as well the domestic violence. His main research practices are based on the psychological determinant of unethical behavior of the psychologist. So he has submitted his PhD thesis under the title of Professional Ethical Belief and Behavior of Clinical Psychologists in Serbia. And that became his outstanding contribution to the subject field. I'm very happy to introduce him because he has completed the 4-year training in the rational emotive behavioral therapy at the REBT Center in Serbia, Belgrade. In addition to that, he has published several articles, chapters for the books, and different projects related to the field on psychology. I would like to mention a few research articles he has done to several reputed journals. The one of the ethical aspect of social trauma research that was published in interdisciplinary textbook that was published in Springer. And the other article, conflict victimization and restorative justice in intercultural setting, an example of AXA research in Serbia, that also published in Routledge. Reimagine security and justice in post-complex society through restorative lens, that also published by the Routledge. The ethics education in applied sports psychology, that was another important article I went from his collection. The religious competency of psychologists who practice psychotherapy in Serbia, that also another article I selected from his list. The effect of ethical position and education on ethical belief on psychologists, psychotherapists in Serbia. So his work related to the psychology as well, the ethical application on psychological studies is addressed to a different folder on psychology. And I have a special mission to introduce him because he is the present president of the ethics board of the Serbian Psychological Society. As well, he is the member of the ethics board of the European Federation of Psychological Associations, because his practice in research ethics in psychology is very much important for our researchers. Therefore, I invite the professor to give a talk to our scholars and our researchers. And I like to, in this moment, to remind because I met you in 2019 at the Psychoanalytic University in Berlin. At that day, you make a very interesting presentation on ethical aspect of trauma research. I got very impressive with that. So I thought to make an opportunity for our scholars to listen to you, Professor. So I'm welcome to you to deliver your lecture.
Thank you, Professor Asha. I'm very glad to be able to speak with you today, thanks to Zoom. And I'm glad that people in Sri Lanka and Serbia can make more, because in Serbia we learn about your capital and that's about it. So I don't know how much you learn about Serbia, but I think I'm very glad that we can exchange experiences and work together in these and other ways. Professor Asha mentioned, well, some of my accomplishments, and I don't think that it's really that important to you. You just have to know that I dedicated my early career to ethics in research and psychotherapy and psychology in general, and that you may ask many questions, and you can interrupt me at any moment. It's not an issue. You can write in the chat or you can interrupt me by voice. It's okay. I won't lose my train of thought, so don't worry about that. So I will start by sharing the presentation, and I hope you can all see it. So, okay, I do hope that you see it. Asha, can you confirm?
Yes, yes, it is
okay.
clear.
Yes, okay, so I will start by mentioning some basic concepts in ethics. And these are procedural ethics that require researchers to articulate the purpose and significance of their project, the ways they will minimize harm, and their data management to the IRBs. For example, in Serbia, we had institutional review boards, but they were not as efficient as they are today. So we did it in 2010. I don't know if Sri Lanka has many of these institutional review boards who can give permission to scholars to publish, to work on their papers, to do their studies. But I think now most papers abroad, especially in the United States, they require that you present your methodology to them in order for them to give you a green light to proceed with your research. So the second one is practical ethics. So those difficult and usually unpredictable situations that can arise during the research practice. So sometimes you just need to deviate from the planned procedure. I can give an example from Serbia. We did a research with the virtual reality system, and when we it was going okay, and they did some exercises while in the virtual reality, but one of the respondents got a panic attack and he threw the equipment from his head and yeah, it was a mess. So yeah, it can influence different people differently, and you have to be prepared for anything. And also maybe for people who have psychosis or something like that, virtual reality would not be a good fit for them, and maybe can produce hallucinations or something like that. So yeah, I think these questions are really not, it's not, because new technologies do usually require some more testing before you can apply them. So the next concepts are the ethical awareness, and that's the awareness that you know that something is wrong, that you're facing an ethical dilemma while doing the research, and also reflexivity, that you analyze the research process itself, and that you sometimes, if you're reflexive, you can change the course of the research or make some adjustments so that you don't fall in the unethics category or do something that would be considered wrong. So why are we talking about ethics? Not just because you have a new department that's dedicated to ethics, but because unethical behavior in research, but also in other areas of psychology and human sciences can lead to health consequences for respondents, to scandals in the university, to criminal charges. If, for example, if a respondent dies or is seriously hurt, lawsuits, bad reputation for the researcher or the institution, low morale of the research team, loss of public trust, loss of job for an individual researcher, or ruined careers for someone. So yeah. In the context of research, so you should do valid research, respect research participants, create socially beneficial policies, and effectively disseminate findings. This last part is sometimes the most tricky part because the first three are relatively easy. So if we start by talking about the history, we can mention Celsius, a famous physician from the 1st century, who said it's not cruel to inflict on a few criminals sufferings which may benefit multitudes of innocent people through all centuries. So yeah, this is not the type of experimentation that we can do in the 21st century, but we did it, unfortunately, in the last century. So Claude Bernard said that experimenters first need to experiment on themselves before experimenting on other people because they knew all the risks. So if you want to experiment something, first try it on yourself. And if it's safe, then you can try it on other people. We have here some examples from German physicians who the first one used a needle and poked a woman in the eye and gave her leprosy, and then he defended himself that that she wouldn't see the experiment from the same view as him, and then it's okay because yeah, he was of course convicted. And the second one tried to find a serum for therapy for syphilis and also experimented on people without their consent. And that was the first time that the Germans did something about it. So they made some guidelines, and it was at the beginning of the last century that that there was a requirement for unambiguous consent. So people have to say it's okay before you put them in an experiment or before you do any kind of research on them. So later in 1930s, there was a BCG vaccine in Germany and it killed 14 infants. And 1 year later, the German ministry issued guidelines. And so they said there has to be a consent and there has to be controlled conditions, and the experiments must be relatively harmless. So, and potential harm must be reasonably proportionate. So even in 1930s, they knew that there has to be some kind of control, some kind of supervision. And then after the Second World War, as you surely know from history, what the Germans did in the Nazi camps, the Nuremberg Code was the first one to change things. And it was the result of the Nuremberg trial. And first, they reaffirmed that informed consent is essential. Then that research should be done primarily on animals and then on humans, not in psychology usually, but yeah, when you do something in medicine, it's sure. The risk should be justified by the anticipated benefits. Only qualified scientists must conduct research. Physical and mental suffering must be avoided at all costs, and research in which death or disabling injury is expected should not be conducted in any manner. So yeah, this is because, so this really, maybe it wouldn't happen in 1947 if it weren't for the Second World War, but I think this is an important first step in regulating research. So the next thing was the Declaration of Helsinki, and it's similar, so very similar, but they explicitly ask for informed consent in writing, because sometimes a researcher could say, well, he agreed, and you have no evidence that he agreed, except if you film him on camera. And we know today that maybe it wouldn't be enough because you can make fake videos or stuff. Also, you can make a fake signature, but who would waste so much time? So it's very similar, but they wanted the informed consent to be in writing, not just in words. The next is Beecher's article. It's an important stepping stone. So Henry Beecher, he was an anesthesiologist. He described 22 examples of research studies with controversial ethics. And this played an important role. And this is the first article that dealt with unethical practices in research. And he started a revolution of a sort. And after that, many other researchers started checking other unethical practices in research. So he's important for the history of this practice. The next step is the Belmont Report, and it was something, as you know, maybe in some principles, in most ethics codes, you can find this. So like respect the persons, minimize harms, be equitable to all, and be just to all, and avoid exploitation. And this is something that's probably something that you know already. And in the end, this is the International Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research, that you should not engage in practices that make unjust conditions worse or take an advantage of inability of vulnerable populations or exploit international regulatory differences for personal and commercial gain. So yeah, all very, very similar. I don't want to waste your time on these law documents because they're not so important. They are important, but most important is what we do. So first, just a small reminder, you probably know something about ethics and philosophy, but I will just mention 3 or 4 of the major theories in ethics, and then I will say what I think about them. So the first one is the utilitarian theory, and it refers to the tendency to assess ethical situations based on their consequences. So what is morally good is what is good for most people. So that's the most basic explanation of this theory. It's more complex than that, but as you can see in the top right corner, the famous trolley experiments. I don't want to waste your time. You probably heard about it, but in this example, the respondent is asked, would you the trolley is going to kill 5 people, and if you turn the lever, then it will turn and kill only 1 person. Should you kill 5? Should you do nothing and 5 people will die, or should you turn the lever and only 1 people will die? So a utilitarian theorist would say you should save 5 people, you should kill 1 person and save 5 people. The next one is the famous Kantian theory. So the ontological moral theory postulates that the only intrinsically good thing is a good will, and his principle is that if something is moral, it must be possible to apply it to all people without a contradiction occurring. So you should only act according to that principle, by which you can at the same time believe that it can be a universal law. So for example, in research, for example, at the start of a research, you made a promise to all your participants that they will, whatever they say will remain confidential. However, what you learned is so interesting and you have a desire to share this information with your friends. The problem is, if you do, the participants will not remain anonymous. Can this be an universal law? Researchers should share all that they can find to and share it with their friends, even the identity of the respondents. So no, because you gave a promise at the start to keep things confidential, and that is why the participants told you their stories. So if they knew you were going to tell your friends, they would not tell you their secrets. So with this principle, you want to know their stories, but at the same time, you do not want to know their stories. And it makes no sense, and it's a logic contradiction. And Kant would say, well, it's not moral then, because you find a contradiction. So it's also a simplification of his theory, but I just want to give you some sense of it. The next one is a feminist ethics of care theory, and the main point is that the researcher should have a genuine care and respect for those who are participants in his study. So ethical caring is the dominant idea. And the last one is something that I already mentioned in the Belmont Report. So it's principalism, applied ethics approach. So something that would be applied to research that do no harm to participants. That you should have, your research should have some benefits. The participants should be autonomous to give their consent. You should be just, so no discrimination, and you should respect dignity and rights of participants, and you should take care of yourself. If you, for example, if you are a researcher who deals with traumatized people or victims of rape or something like that, if you talk to many people who have these problems and experiences, sometimes it can have a toll on yourself. So you have to take care of yourself as well. So, but the only problem is, are these principles shared? So do Serbs, Sri Lankans, Americans, do they all share the same principles? So in the end, we can ask, why do researchers behave unethically? So first is sometimes we have cognitive dissonance. For example, we do something and then we say, well, it's okay if we do it only sometimes, and we can do something like self-deceptions and rationalizations, like Freud would say. So the next thing is, colleagues do not report us because they're friends with us. They don't know to get in trouble. They don't want to confront us. For example, in the, I don't know if you have that in Sri Lanka or in India, or but there is a court of honor in Serbia, and when a psychologist breaks the ethical code, he would go to court. And it's not a court like a court in the state, but it's a court of psychologists. And then you have to present your case, you can have a lawyer and stuff like that. It's similar to a regular court, but you have no criminal charges. It's just to determine if you broke ethics, and you can have a fine, or you can be, for example, you can lose your license, or you can you can lose your license for a certain period, or you must have an additional education or something like that. But it can be just like a verbal reprimand. But the focus is that sometimes is not such issues that make researchers do stuff, but usually it's a pressure from other researchers, or to keep your job, to promote yourself. For example, if you're an assistant professor, you want to become a full professor, and it's status, fame, financial gain from projects, other stuff. Sometimes it's power or false feeling of control that makes you take risks, or negligence or inadequate training, or sometimes you just don't know. So for example, students, and like Bante mentioned at the beginning, sometimes you just make a mistake, or you just don't know if it's forbidden. So that are also reasons. So first we can go through all this stuff, and it's good that you're recording, because if someone watches this later, it will be easier to follow. But the first thing is fake co-authorship or authorship trade. So you know a colleague, and he needs to be on a paper because he needs a paper to be promoted in the university, and then you add him to the paper, and he did nothing to to help your research. Also, you can trade authorship. So I will give you my paper and you give me your paper, or put me on your paper and I will put you on my paper. It's a common practice, unfortunately. So plagiarism by mistake or intentionally. Also auto-plagiarism, when you mention something from your earlier paper, but you don't mention it's from your earlier paper. Also fake peer review. So in some journals you have that. There are usually predatory journals who charge you fee and stuff like that. And authorship for sale. For example, some people may have too many papers, and they can say, well, I wrote a paper, who wants to buy it? And fabricating results is also very common, and falsifying them in order to make them statistically significant. Also, people forget to get permission from the institutional review board, and then sometimes they ask for it later. Sometimes years later, they ask, can I do something I did in 2007? So yeah, it makes no sense, but people do it. Also, post hoc hypothesis, when you pretend that you had a hypothesis at the beginning, but no, you just saw the results and then you make the hypothesis. So it's usually something what students do in their papers. Sending papers to multiple journals at the same time, usually it's frowned upon, it's a forbidden practice. not mentioning relevant authors in the subject field. Sometimes you can leave out people who you do not like. Conflicts of interests, for example, if there is a sponsor of your paper or something like that. Publishing without the approval of all authors. Sometimes people do that. And leaving out authors or too many fake authors. Sometimes you just you have the professor and the next professor, and they did nothing, and you just have to do it because there is a pressure to do it, and if you don't do it, you will have consequences. So yeah, that of course it's unethical, and of course it should be punished. But in many countries, there is just no mechanism to protect people from this. So yeah. And also order of authors. Sometimes you did all the work and your professor is the first author and you did everything. So you should be the first author and he should be the second author if he only helped you. And open science and the possibility of replication. So you know that there is a trend for open science, and so you give your SPSS that database or something like that, and then other researchers can check your data and do other analysis with them, and it's only possible if you give them access to your paper. And also that probably you heard in India for LibGen or C-Hub or other methods to get free papers or free books. And yeah, it's a form of authorship piracy, but still it's something that helps researchers. But open science should solve all that, because research maybe should be free and accessible to everyone, because science should be. And we see that in this current time of anti-vaccination lobbies and flat earthers and stuff like that. So I think science should be available to most people. But possibility of replication is the next thing. So you probably heard about the replication crisis in psychology, more specifically social psychology, and they had a big issue with that. And it was determined that many of the papers are just not valid, and you cannot replicate the results. So what did they discover if it's not something that's permanent? Also, there is failing to report protocol deviations if you change something in mid of your research, or selective reporting or focus on outcomes favorable to study hypothesis, particularly statistically significant results. So there is flexibility in data collection, analysis, it's so-called p-hacking, also disregarding results that contradict initial hypothesis, so you make your paper look better. Also misleading interpretation, unfunding extrapolation for you do something on a small research and then on a small group of people and say, so it's, for example, you do a small paper on refugees and you determine that there are some criminals among them, and then you say all refugees are criminals. And also ignoring limitations of your study, and every study has limitations. And also publication bias. Sometimes journals have an agenda for confirmatory research and inflated results. And I can see that in our students in Serbia, that sometimes they're very sad if their master thesis has no significant results. But it's also research. Even if you get nothing, then someone else can look at your paper and say, okay, this is not, if you got nothing, if I research this, I will also probably get nothing. So maybe you shouldn't research this. So even bad data, even when you get a negative result, I think it's something good for science. So there is a publication bias, unfortunately, in journals that requires more confirmatory research than negative research. In this slide, you can see something from the paper from 2012, and this was done, research done on psychologists. So the control group here are people who were just asked about their unethical practices, and the BTS group is the group who got an incentive to be truthful. And you can see here, so most of them, they failed to report all dependent measures. So they didn't report all studies conditions. They stopped collecting data earlier than planned in almost 22% of cases. they rounded off the p-value, which is you can see almost 4th of the participants did that, so it's really not good. And they selectively reported studies that worked, so in almost half of the cases. So I think if you look at this, you can see that psychologists do make unethical research, and I also proved that when I did my dissertation on unethical practices in psychotherapy. So psychologists make a lot of mistakes, unfortunately, but I think lectures like this and education can maybe influence people, especially young people, not to make these mistakes and to do everything by the book, even if it's not the best course of action at the moment, but it's what's good for science in general. So also in this other journal, I missed the year, but sorry about that, but it's from 2009. So they showed that their results of 281 articles indicate that around 18% of statistical results are incorrectly reported, and inconsistencies were more common in low impact journals, and around 15% of the articles contained at least one statistical conclusion that proved upon recalculation to be incorrect. So even mathematical things like rounding errors, wrong use of text, p-value missing, or stuff like that, it's very, very common in journals, unfortunately, especially in low impact journals. So, you probably heard about the most famous controversial psychology experiments. I don't want to waste your time, but the Milgram experiment, where he forced participants to shock people, or they at least thought they shocked people to death. Also the Stanford prison experiments, where the group of guards tortured the prisoners. The monster study, where they did with children, unfortunately, with probably horrible consequences, and little Albert, who unfortunately died, and they didn't cure him of his phobia. So yeah, they didn't have a really good plan for any of these studies, and they didn't. For example, for the Stanford prison experiment, Zimbardo stopped it only because his girlfriend told him to stop it because she thought it was unbearable to watch. So yeah. And Zimbardo became a famous social psychologist, even that. So this is the first part of my lecture, and I have a second part, don't worry. But for now, I just want to see if there are any questions or something that provoked you to ask anything. And I will continue after that.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can put on to Professor. Otherwise, you can drop in a chat box.
Yeah, it's also, you can do it in the chat. Yeah. Okay, so I will start now with vulnerable populations. And I think this is something that most institutional review boards ask about, because they ask about, did you do everything? How do you plan to avoid harmful events for the participants? And especially if they're vulnerable, they will ask you more questions. As if you go to a school and interview pupils, then there will be no such questions. But if you do something with rape victims, then they will have a lot of questions, because they will be afraid that your research might cause them further harm. So yeah, this is an important topic. And I think the first thing is the research re-traumatization for people? So for example, if someone has PTSD, so will the research harm him? So most of the research shows that it's completely different to talk about it and to experience it. So most research shows that there is a relatively low risk of re-traumatization. So if we don't research, we are not giving these people a voice. And there is like a conspiracy silence if we don't give them the voice. So I think we should research traumatized people, but you should be more careful when researching them in order how to ask questions, how to make a good relationship with these people, in order for them not to be for not to have a secondary victimization or to cause them harm. Second thing is that research shows that they have a favorable cost-benefit ratio. So trauma-related survey research has been shown to have a favorable cost-benefit ratio, and the same goes with children. So that means you should do research with traumatized people. And what are the main benefits is the social value, application possibilities, involvement of local communities, direct or indirect help to individuals or communities. When someone talks about his experiences, it's similar to psychotherapy. So sometimes people get closure, people get some post-traumatic growth, they have new insights. Sometimes you say something that can be helpful. Sometimes you're just there to listen to them and you wish to help others, and maybe they feel valued or listened to, being treated with respect, and it is a meaningful and a positive experiences in most cases. So I think there is benefit in doing research with trauma victims, but you should be careful. Also, sometimes this is something that was in Sri Lanka, and Shrag, he in 2010 he made an example where the IRB told the researcher not to mention violence while studying the everyday experiences of Sri Lankan children after the civil war. So another IRB asked the researcher not to ask participants if they would join the study, but to make a poster to invite them, because asking these vulnerable people might be coercive. So this is an example from your country. So when you send your application to an IRB, you should probably cite research that shows low probability of your question distressing respondents and point out the benefits of the study. And sometimes people are just afraid. Even psychologists, they're afraid that your research might harm someone. So yeah, I think that you should, when you want to present something to the institutional review board, you should gather all the evidence that your research should not harm participants in order to prove that your research is valid and that it's done in other countries. I know there are some cultural differences between Serbia, Sri Lanka, United States, but in most cases, people are very similar and they have similar experiences when faced with trauma. So yeah, I think that what works in other countries, I think it's probably relatable to Sri Lanka and as well. Okay, so the next thing is the competence of researchers. So when you get knowledge from formal training at your university, also you listen to me now, so it's also like a formal training. Also, you can have technical specific skills for interviewing, for making methodology plans, for conducting statistical analysis, etc. Also, something that can be learned is to be ethically sensitive. When you listen to my lecture, I think you will be more ethically sensitive and you can do better things with that. Also, when you know ethical codes and laws where you conduct your research, for example, if you travel to India, you should know Indian laws because maybe they are different than Sri Lankan laws. So empathy and emotional stability is next, because if you're emotionally unstable, for example, your wife left you and you want to do a study about the divorces, maybe you are not the most emotionally stable person to do that research after your wife left you. So you should be emotionally stable, and you should also have empathy. It's a requirement for psychologists, but not all psychologists, unfortunately, have much empathy. So, and also you should be aware of limitations of competence when you're ill, when you're under a great deal of stress. So, for example, I don't know if you know, but in 1999, Serbia was bombed by the NATO, and during that time, psychologists were also doing research and they were under a great deal of stress. So bombs were falling on buildings and they did research. So it was not an easy thing to do. And they also did psychotherapy. So it's hard for psychologists to work in such conditions. So I think also insufficient experience, insufficient knowledge of the situation and the socio-political context, culture of the respondents. For example, if I travel to Sri Lanka, I would not know much. I know about your culture in general. I saw some documentaries on the TV. I saw how Sri Lanka looks like, but I don't know much about your experiences, or I know that there was a war, a civil war, but I don't know the details. So maybe if I came to do research, I would maybe ask the wrong thing, or maybe I would offend someone. So I would have to talk to a Sri Lankan psychologist first to be educated about these things, and then maybe I could do research in Sri Lanka. So the same goes for you if you come to Serbia. So the culturally competent research. So you should avoid microaggressions. For example, we did the research, I don't know, but you probably heard about the migration from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iran to Europe. And at one point we had 100,000 refugees on the main square in Belgrade. And we gave them psychological support, food, other stuff, and they stayed in camps for a short while because they wanted to go to Germany. And during that time, one of our colleagues, researcher, asked about the anxiety and the trauma they experiences, and one of the respondents from Afghanistan said that he got anxious because a genie, like a ghost, entered him and he gave him anxiety. And the researcher smiled and said, well, you're 50 years old, do you still believe in ghosts? And he used the translator, but still it's a problem because this is like a microaggression, because in Afghanistan, people believe that illnesses come from Allah or from God, and also come from genies who attack your body. So yeah, there are some people who of course believe in science, but you should not make microaggressions. You should not make fun of people because they believe in something. So also to solicit the experiences of others who are knowledgeable of the culture. So cultural anthropologists, or as I mentioned, someone from Sri Lanka would be helpful to me if I did the research in Sri Lanka. Involve the indigenous communities in the definition of the research design, and the interpretation of dissemination of the results. So if the community is involved, then the research should be better, because when you have a focus group, when you have more people are more smart than one person. So seek guidance from local informants or influential people within that culture. Consider the level of literacy. And so I don't know what's the level, for example, of literacy in Sri Lanka, but I know that in mountains in Serbia, there are many villagers who are very old and they are illiterate. Even if they know how to write and read, they don't know how to use a mobile phone. So or internet. So they're illiterate in today's terms. So you should not dumb down materials in a way that would make them insulting. So don't make something that would be written for children, for adults, but you should be aware that sometimes you need to use pictures or other stuff. And also culturally adequate instruments. For example, if you know about psychology, there are psychology tests for intelligence. And for example, Raven's matrices, they can be applied to almost any culture because they have no wording, they are just pictures. But if you ask, for example, in the Serbian test of intelligence, you can ask, for example, who wrote that famous book? It's a Serbian book, and of course, no one from Sri Lanka would know how to answer that, and then they would appear to be less intelligent, and it makes no sense because tests need to be culturally adequate. You need to ask something that would be relevant to that culture where you do the research. So in other terms, you need to make instruments that are relevant, and sometimes you need to modify them to be relevant for your population. Also, there should be some research supervisors who have an ethical responsibility to assure that the research sets out to be good science, so that it's conducted competently, that it is supervised, and that risk to both participants and staff is minimized. For example, you need to be aware of recruitment procedures. So in example from Serbia, in 2010, I did the research on violence in families, so domestic violence in one part of Serbia. And we went from house to house. And when you talk to people, you have to be very careful. For example, because if the violent husband is at home and you start talking, can I ask you some questions about domestic violence? Maybe he will come and kick you in the face and also punish his wife for even talking to you. So you have to be very, very careful with the safe recruitment procedures. And also in some areas, for example, where there was a civil war, I imagine that, for example, we had a civil war in Yugoslavia. And if you talk to neighbors and the neighbors in small communities know that the researchers came to town, maybe if you talk to them, you can be a traitor because they are from another ethnic group. And I don't know, I think it would be difficult. I know that Sri Lanka and the Tamil population had an issue. So I don't know if someone went to a Tamil ethnic group and asked them questions, would they be considered traitors if they responded your questions? I don't know. But in Yugoslavia, it was an issue after the war. So it's just an idea, a food for thought for you. So supervision should not only focus on the technical aspects of trauma research work, but include an emotional check-in that allows expression of trauma work's emotional responses. Because even if you're a researcher, sometimes if you're a young researcher and you work with such difficult populations and you hear about rape or other stuff that someone did, you sometimes need to talk to someone because you need to validate their feelings, and they have to have someone to talk to. So it would be good to have a head researcher who deals with supervision and support for younger researchers. Also, the next thing is general in most research. So we mentioned it because it's not just in psychology, but in any good research with humans. So informed consent. First, you need to see who will give the consent. Can the person give consent? Do you need to contact their parents because they're minors? Do you need other caregivers, the state or adopted parents or someone like that? So also some people are unable to give valid consent. For example, because they're illiterate, they don't understand you, they have mental issues or stuff like that. Also, withdrawal of consent is also important. You need to give an option to your participants to give up at any time and to be erased from your research. It's a hard thing for a researcher, but you have to do it. So what should you give what information should be given to participants? First, you need to explain who you are, the nature and purpose of the research, the expected duration of their participation. For example, if it's going to be 3 days, they won't gonna participate. If it's 15 minutes, then maybe it's okay. So confidentiality and anonymity issues, to explain that everything will be confidential and how you will keep this information confidential. For example, in a computer that it is not connected to the internet and not available to hackers. Warning about potential risk and distress. So sometimes you can even cause, from experiments, if you say to your respondents, now you will feel sick, they probably will feel sick if you do that. So it's like the opposite of placebo. Also, financial and other benefits for them, it's very important. The right not to answer questions if they want to skip questions. Who can they contact to find out more information about the research? So what will you do to protect data? And also, sometimes, like in psychotherapy, especially if you work in a country that had a war, sometimes a person can tell you that he committed a war crime, or that he committed rape, or that he committed something else that is punishable by law. And then you have to tell them in advance that if they tell you something, that you will maybe need to report it to the police. And you should know the laws in a certain country. For example, in Serbia, if someone tells you he killed someone, you would have to report it. But if you're a doctor, you wouldn't have to report it. But also, a doctor like from medicine, not a doctor like PhD. For example, if someone tells you I killed a person 51 years ago, then you would not report him, because reporting that would be a crime. Because after 50 years passes, murder becomes irrelevant in Serbia. So it goes, you cannot be punished after 50 years if you kill someone. Not is a war crime, war crimes are forever, but if you kill someone like in a normal way, not in a war, then you would not be punished after 50 years. So yeah, so you would have to know other laws. For example, what if someone stole something? For example, in Serbia, and someone stole something and he admits it to you in psychotherapy or in research, you would not have to report him. But I don't know about Sri Lanka, maybe you do. So laws are different. Informed consent consists of 3 components. So first, you need to give the people adequate information. Second, they have to agree to participate by their own will, and they have to be competent. You have to be competent, and they have to be competent to participate. So they have to have sufficient time to consider participation. Also, assent is something different. So it's an expressed willingness to participate in research by persons who are by definition too young to give informed consent, but that are old enough to understand the proposed research. So, for example, if a person is 14 years old, he can say, okay, I will participate, but you still have to get a permission from the school or permission from the parents. Informed consent is not merely a form that is signed, but it is a process in which the subject has an understanding of the research and its risks. So the researchers should provide opportunity for the prospective participants to ask questions and receive answers. And also there are translation issues. Sometimes you have a translation issue like if you translate something wrong, then the person would not understand, and then maybe he would give his consent, but it would not be a valid consent. And also sharing data and consent. So if you're going to share your data, for example, with a researcher from United States, and you want to publish something together, you have to have consent from your respondent for this information to be shared and sent to another country. So you have to ask in advance before you do any research. So do they know what they are getting into? Probably not, but no, non-technical language should be avoided, and also complicated text because it can confuse people. So you should not use exculpatory language. So we are not responsible if something happens to you or stuff like that. So no induction of positive answers. So you should not ask people, do you want the law to change? So or something like that that would provoke the answer yes. Also to give coercive conditions. So sometimes people are afraid, for example, if you go to a refugee camp, people could fear that they could have repercussions, for example, be expelled from the camp if they don't participate in your research. Also participation out of fear, desperation, or unrealistic expectation. For example, they will get asylum if they participate in your research. People can have many ideas. So also, what if you do undercover research? If you go to a group of criminals or to a band of hooligans, of soccer hooligans, and then you do research with them, well, and they don't know that they are participants in the study, yeah, it can be a tricky business, especially if you get caught. So also, you can get consent at several stages, not just once, you can ask many times. And also it can be a negotiated consent. Sometimes respondents can ask, okay, but I want also this to be included in the consent agreement. So there are also literacy issues, as I explained before. You can explain with images, and sometimes people are afraid to give you signature because they are afraid you will use their signature to get money from the bank from them or something like that. And also sometimes people just sign the form without reading, they don't just care. So you have to tell them, please read it because they are important information. So maybe don't make the informed consent form too long because people don't like to read things that are too long. So one should not be paternalistic in assuming that all trauma victims are vulnerable, that they cannot give rational informed consent. So same goes for children, and for those, they can give consent if they're traumatized. So this is a consent quiz for children. For example, you can ask, what kinds of things we will do today? What will happen if you tell me about a kid who is being hurt by someone? Do you have to do everything I ask you to? Do you have to do everything I ask you to do today? Do you have to answer every question I ask? So you can ask like this, and then you can see if the child understands that he can give up at any moment and stuff like that. This is a very simple way of asking. So I think you can understand why this is a good way to talk to children. So if you use translators, for example, if you come to Serbia or India or I don't know, Burma or something that is close to you. So if you use translators, there can be misunderstandings. For example, we had a funny example. We had a person who, okay, I will stop this so I can see you, but no one has the camera, so yeah, it doesn't matter. So we had a person who was in the refugee camp in Serbia, and he and his wife was a participant, and he was translating for his wife. And the researcher asked, was she anxious during the trip through Syria, through Turkey, and stuff like that. And she started talking like blah, 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 blah. And she was talking for 10 minutes. And then the researcher asked the husband, what did she say? And the husband said, no. So it was the whole translation of the 10-minute talk. So sometimes, yeah, there can be misunderstandings when you use translators. So let's go back to the presentation. So there are also privacy issues. And relations of translators and respondents, sometimes these people are from the same group as your subject population, and they can have more than one relation. They can be friends or relatives or something like that, and it can influence the research. And also there is a risk that hearing about rape and other stuff, translators are not trained psychologists or psychotherapists. So if they hear something so horrible, they could be traumatized as well. Not just these people who are traumatized, the translators could be traumatized. So you have to take that into account and have some sort of response for that. Also, confidentiality. Also, I mentioned that sometimes you have a scientist-citizen dilemma and maybe you have to report a crime. Also, when do you break confidentiality? When someone tells you he raped someone, when someone tells you he killed someone, or what else? So there are legal consequences for self-incriminations. And how long does confidentiality last? Until someone dies, or even after someone dies? It's even after. Are the responses really anonymous? Because sometimes if you do qualitative research, then someone can deduct who that person is if it's a small community. And how do we protect data and how long do we keep it? So do we use it? Do we use a computer that is not connected to the internet? Do we use a flash drive? Do we use a laptop? And what if we lose the laptop? What if we lose the flash data? What if we lose the papers? Or what if someone comes into our office and looks at the papers? Stuff like that. So have a good key, have a good code. So have a code breaking system on your computer. So a good system can prevent someone from hacking. Also, the type of data gathered about individuals' identities. So if you gather data about something that's in their ID card, then maybe it can be deductible who that person is. Also, you can change data, you can use pseudonyms, and also what if the researcher dies in the middle of the research? What if a cleaning lady comes into his office and finds all his research, and then she can see everything? Maybe she doesn't understand, but she can see. So you have in Serbia, we have something called professional will. So if the researcher or psychologist dies, his family will inherit everything, his houses, his cars and stuff like that, but they will not inherit his research data. It will go to another researcher, and it has to be specified in this professional will. So no one wants to die, but we have to be prepared for that. So working conditions, for example, privacy in refugee camps, can people hear through the tents? And also sometimes you work in countries that are surveilled. For example, I think in Myanmar, in Burma, I think their current situation is like the military is in power, and maybe if you go there, maybe they will control what you do, and people will be afraid to participate in the research. So in qualitative research, representation is complex. Since sample sizes are often small and findings frequently include interview experts, participants may remain identifiable despite the identification. So the research must carefully negotiate between giving voice to the unique experiences of participants and preserving participants' anonymity or privacy. So, for instance, if you keep their gender identity in the choice of the pronoun, for example, you say she, that must be weighed against the possibility that that person can be recognizable. So these decisions become more difficult where gender plays a pivotal role in the analysis, where you need this woman to be a female in order to make sense of the data. So it can become a problem if it's a really small community. The second part is the recruitment of participants. So first, you need to make a fair selection so anyone can get in the research. Researchers need to demonstrate cultural understanding in order to recruit, so in the most appropriate manner. I don't know, would it be would it be nice to shake hands, for example, with someone in Sri Lanka, or to bow? I don't know. I'm not sure how you say hello. So that's the first thing. And then also I would need to know other things. So also negotiate recruitment with networks directly or word of mouth. A different process may be needed for recruiting vulnerable participants, for example, through a liaison where a trusted contact might be used. And also researchers could consider whether a proxy source of information could answer the focal research questions. Maybe you don't need to ask the traumatized people if you can find that information in another way. Also, you can develop multiple relations with respondents. So first, when you spend a lot of time in a small community, you can make friends. And if you make friends, then it's really hard to do research on your friends. So participants may want something in return, or they need our help. And that can make us have double relations with these people. And that would be a problem, like it is a problem in psychotherapy. So you cannot be maybe objective, and there is a power differential because you have more power than them. So what I remembered something. I wanted to mention this when I talked about the informed consent. I don't know why I remember it now, but for example, there is a Guarani tribe in South America that in their culture, it's impossible to say no. If someone asks a favor from you, for example, to participate in the research, they would not be able to say no, because in their culture, saying no to stuff like that is like really, really bad. So you could really use these people, and yeah, it could have horrible consequences, because you should know that in their culture, saying no to such things is like really frowned upon. So also touching people, for example, traumatized people, touching them on the shoulder or touching them like handshake. For example, if you're a man and you interview a raped woman, maybe it's not the best way. Also, for example, I know that when Muslim women came to Serbia, it would be more appropriate for a woman to talk to them and not a man. Also gifts, sometimes they give you gifts. And sometimes you may give gifts to clients to participate, but also respect for the respondents as equal is really important. And also, if you have a current or previous relationship, it can be a problem. For example, you cannot do research on your wife or your ex-wife. And also, you should not exploit people or do like helicopter research. Helicopter research is when you come to a country, do the research, and then run away. And you leave these people traumatized, and you talk with them and you confuse their minds, and you just run away and not have any idea what to do after that. No debriefing, no anything with these people. So researchers must be engaging and authentic to study subjects as a means of building rapport and obtaining genuine data. However, they must also remain objective and psychologically unaffected by the material. And the collecting data can cause practitioners to feel mechanical, shut off, and maybe to lose empathy, even if you work with traumatized people especially. So conducting research into sensitive topics can result in someone developing a closeness to a participant and have like a quasi-therapeutic relation with them. And also it can be a typical interview can be longer than a typical therapy session, and it may elicit more recollection of traumatic events. And also the power differential is different in psychotherapy and in research. And also self-disclosure. So sometimes you should consider how much personal narrative to give your people. Maybe it's good. Feminist researchers advocate this, highlighting the possibility for greater engagement. However, it can lead to researcher vulnerability and scrutiny. So you should be careful when you talk about something from your personal life. For example, as a psychotherapist, I can say to my clients who have a fear of elevators, I can tell them that I had also a fear of elevator when I was a teenager, but maybe it would not be good to share my sexual fantasies. So it would be very, very bad in psychotherapy. Also here, you should carefully choose what you should give to people. So also there are representation issues. So will research participants be distressed when they learn how they are described? There are many examples where people were angry after the researcher went and wrote a book about them. So will they agree about how they are represented as a community? Will they be placed at risk from others in their situation? For example, if you paint the refugees in a bad, if you paint them in a bad light, would there be violence against them? Also, researchers sometimes ask participants to vet or to otherwise edit or approve data and even interpretations, especially in qualitative research. And disputed material may be omitted, or disagreements about materials may be included in reports. So reports and presentations may be composed to include multiple voices, and it's usually the best way. So next thing, it's important to capture experiences close to the traumatic event as the memory is resolved, becoming less detailed, and the creation of comfortable interview environment, considerations and appropriateness of venue need to be thought carefully, because, for example, one researcher had like a tent in a camp, and on the camp there was a sign, please, rape victims, please come forward to talk about your experiences. So for anyone to go to this tent, everyone would know that this person was raped. So it was not a good way for a setting to talk with people. So encouragement for participation. So researchers should make reasonable efforts to avoid offering excessive or inappropriate financial or other inducements for research participation when such inducements are likely to coerce participation. So if you offer someone from a really poor community, like 1,000 euros or $1,000, maybe this person would feel coerced. So he cannot say no, because that's a kind of money he just cannot refuse, even if he doesn't want to participate. So it would really change the data in the bad way. So yeah. Also, you can never be completely neutral. If you see someone who is in a bad situation or being, for example, a victim of domestic violence, should you report it? Is there a law that you should report such a thing? So you should not make exaggerations of the weight of a single research. So we have a saying like one bird does not make spring. So in this case, it would be one bird does make spring. So if one bird comes, for example, because in Serbia, some type of birds come only in the spring. So this would be a case where you should say that one case. So if one person that was a refugee has anxiety, you can say all refugees are anxious, and that would be a wrong conclusion. So results are not sometimes in line with advocacy agenda or the persons who are paying for the project. And sometimes if you get something like that, you can get in trouble with people who finance your research project. And yeah, but you should stay true to the science and not change anything because someone asks you to change anything. So you should be really careful about that. Also, there are political issues. So sometimes in post-conflict societies like Yugoslavia, like Sri Lanka, there is propaganda, there is different truths for different people on different sides of the battle. So research can be a tool of political interventions, and there could be pressures on researchers to paint something in a certain way. And sometimes if you have a multi-ethnic research team, sometimes there can be fights within the team because they would not agree on how to interpret the data. And also social impact of research can lead to stigma and further divisions if you make a bad public image about a group of respondents. And if you present them in a bad light, someone could say, well, that's not politically correct today. So you should be really, really careful, because in the 23rd century, you saw that there is a cancel culture for everything. So maybe soon they will start canceling researchers if they do something bad. Also, neutrality, can we control our prejudices and values from interfering in the research process? So can we really be objective, because we are also humans? And also, are there situations where we cannot be neutral, like ongoing human rights abuses and violations? So, and sometimes we can cry during an interview or something if we hear something horrible, like a child dying or something like that. So it can impact our neutrality, and we are not completely neutral. We have our prejudices, we have our values, and they are not the same as our respondents, especially if we go to another culture. So for trauma-informed research, you should ask questions in a sensitive manner, giving respondents enough time to think and answer, provide the opportunity to skip questions, to give them a way to participate in checking the results before publishing them, to promote recovery, to coordinate with humanitarian relief, and to do an evaluation in the end to see how the research impacted them, and did it make any harm, or was it just good for them? So after the research, how to end the relationship? So sometimes people have a feeling of loss. They became your friends or something like that, especially in qualitative research. So you have some post-research obligations. So to make follow-ups, referrals, for example, you should refer them to a psychotherapist or to a doctor if they're feeling sick or they're traumatized. So if researchers become aware that research procedures have harmed the participants, they should have reasonable steps to minimize. So replication could needlessly repeat the same studies with the same samples at the potential expense of harming them. So you should not make multiple research on the same population. So still replication is very important, but you should consider that it's more important for these people to feel well, not to have your research results. So what are the risks? So sometimes if the risks are well defined and clear to the participant on the beginning, then it's okay. So if it's just going to be distress or overburdening to be participant in multiple studies, or stigmatization or retribution for associating with researchers. Sometimes in some countries in Africa, there was even murders for associating with researchers. So you should be very careful for not making your respondents have any law or any quarrels with their neighbors after they participate in your research. So you should really take good care of that. So if things do go wrong, and sometimes they do go wrong, you should do a debriefing. So it's a brief discussion of positive neutral topics that usually improves mood significantly. You should explain your research, especially debriefing is really something you have to do if you use deception in research. So especially in social psychology, if you use deception, not tell the people what the research is really about, you have to debrief them at the end and tell them what the research was really about. And also referrals for assessment and treatment. What if there is no such resources? I don't know how many psychotherapists there are in Sri Lanka, and I don't know if there is enough for all the people who can be research participants and who can be victims of something and they need help. So I don't know if it can be done in a proper manner. So debriefing, they should make sure that they will have enough time to deal with unexpected situation. If a participant becomes distressed or discloses sensitive information about an unsafe situation. So the goal of this is to help subjects cope with new information about themselves that they came about during the research, and normalization of behaviors, feelings, and other stuff. So to return the subject to the pre-research state, that's the goal of the briefing. And even if the non-deceived subject can leave confused or carrying misconceptions about the research, so you should inform participants about the study after carefully checking for any confusion they might have. So it can be like interrogation, education, emotional restoration, all of that. For example, Milgram, in his famous experiment, he had friendly reconciliation with the participants, and he revealed the deception. And during those sessions, he reported that there was no harm. But in today's standards, Milgram experiment was not okay. So when IRBs ask applicants to describe the briefing, that does not to mean include the briefing script. So the vagueness of this application could keep the IRB in the dark. So you should really explain how will you do the debriefing, what will you say, what will be, maybe they will read something or they would be explained, what will you exactly do. So sometimes the institutional review boards needs to see this. So what are the risks for researchers? First, there is risk of physical threat or abuse. So we had, for example, when we did that domestic violence research, I had a person attack me because I came to his house to interview his wife. So yeah, that was not a good thing. He came to the house early. So risk of psychological trauma as a result of actual threatened violence, risk of being in a compromising situation, increased exposure to the risk of everyday life. For example, even if you drive to your, for example, my colleague had a car accident while going to do research. So it's also a risk for a researcher. And risk of causing psychological and physical harm to others. So it's also a risk because you can feel bad, feel guilty. Then you can have over-identification with the participants. You can be too hurt, frightened, emotionally overwhelmed, difficult to do with the job if you don't have any counseling skills. Also, you can be traumatized, which leads to errors, loss of interest, etc. You can be burned out, you know all about that. You can minimize, forget stuff, try to repress it. Also, female researchers have been shown to be more vulnerable than male researchers. I don't think that female are less strong than men, but research shows that they are maybe more empathetic than men, and that's why they're more influenced by this. Also, if you have your own history of violence and mental health problems, maybe you're too vulnerable to do such research. And also you can have researcher guilt. For example, if you go to Africa and see children starving and not being able to do anything about it, or not be able to do enough, you can have some sort of guilt. So what's the consequences of vicarious traumatization? First, you can not go to work, you can be socially isolated, you can be more suspicious, you can have a more pessimistic worldview, so you have like persistent dreams. For example, when I started my career, I was a psychologist working with rape victims, and I needed, after hearing a story about rape, I would have these images in my head. So I would have to walk home, not to go by bus or to drive a car. I would have to walk because I needed to like forget about it and like feel better. But when I worked at that job, I really sensed that they said, Nicola, you are darker now. You are not so happy as you were before. It really influenced me. So field research can consist of high involvement with psychologically disturbing situations, while also demanding neutrality and professional boundaries. So conducting qualitative research or field research can be physically, emotionally, and spiritually challenging. And because of exposure to traumatic material, transcriptionists can also be emotionally damaged. For example, if someone writes the transcript and reads about the rape, reads about the violence, he can also be traumatized. So you must think about the translators, you must think about all these people who are involved in the research, because they also would maybe require help. So what are the solutions to all of the problems I mentioned? First, training and supervision. You're doing that today by listening to me. Also, self-care, like healthy life, rest, vacations, hanging out with friends, writing, gardening, psychotherapy, other stuff. Provision from ongoing emotional support and workload management. It's the most important thing. If you work too much, you will burn out. And schedule like team meetings, like emotional checkups with your research team, and then you can all share what happened. And I think it's a very good thing, and I think it can help mediate some of these problems. So how to solve ethical dilemmas? First, you have to describe yourself what the ethical dilemma is. For example, your research participant gives you chocolate. So in some cultures, it's okay to receive gifts from people. In some cultures, it's not. So determine who is responsible for solving, consult ethics codes, laws, colleagues, lawyers, and evaluate the rights, responsibilities, and welfare of all included parties. For example, sometimes it's not your responsibility to solve the problem. Sometimes it's your institution, not yourself. So you should keep that in mind. Also, you should identify as many, if you have time, of course, as many alternative solutions as you can. Do a risk-benefit analysis for every solution. Choose the best course of action, and then evaluate, would I do the same thing again? Would I be able to tell my psychologist colleagues about what I did, and would they think that I did something bad? So think about measures to prevent further similar events. How can you prevent that these unethical things keep happening? For example, you have someone in your team who wants to change data. That would be a bad thing, so you would have to talk to this person. So there are many ways you can ask yourself, would I recommend this solution to others in a similar situation? Could I explain my choice to colleagues, publish it in a journal, or present it at a conference? And would the decision be the same, for example, if the respondents were different? For example, for someone who you have a beautiful person, someone who you really like as a respondent, and you would do something more for this person than for maybe another participant. If you would do more for this person, then something is unethical there. So you should be just to all and to all respondents, not just one. So ethics is not just a series of steps. Ethical thinking should begin at the conceptualization of research, and it should be guided by some broader ethical norms. So that's why I talked to you about the ethical theories. And I know this lecture is not enough to solve all your ethical issues that you might come up with during your work, but I think it maybe opened your eyes about what people do wrong and what can be problems in the research process, and what you should keep in mind when you organize the study. You should think of these things in advance to prevent ethical misconduct. So I really thank you for your attention. This is my email. I will write it in the chat. And also I will give my presentation to Asha, and she will also give it to you. So Asha told me that it needs to be 1 hour and a half, but I finished 10 minutes early, and I think we have times for questions now, and we can talk about this.
Thank you very much, sir. Your detailed and factual presentation, and I will share the PPT with my student, but now I would like to open the forum for discussion. So the participant, now you can put your questions, comment or suggestions to the professor, and you can unmute your mic, and then you can ask the question, and even you can drop your questions to the chat box itself. Yeah, this is the time for a question and the discussion.
Yeah, if they have any, and I hope they do.
Yeah.
Manto, do you have any more questions? You had one at the beginning, so maybe you have more.
Yes, Professor, thank you very much. I'm Ajwa dear. So I had to join a bit late, but at the latter part, I catched up your presentation. It was very interesting and very timely. And because Dr. Asha and we are also involved in some ethical activities to evaluate ethics as well. Professor, I have a small issue related to now informed consent. Now, particularly if you are observing, in public space, how we can handle informed consent in that case? Do you have an idea? Because yes,
Can you give me a specific example? What do you mean in a public space? If you do
now,
research,
for example, now let's say, Professor, I'm trying to see how the students' study habits, how they are studying and how they are doing their work in a public space, maybe the university. So, Professor, but I'm not going to tell that I'm observing them because it's not possible because it's in public space, and sometimes I might lose the total purpose of the research if I tell them that I'm going to observe it because I'm a lecturer. So, Professor, now in that case, would it violate any ethics? What do you think?
yes. Well, it's like filming someone with your camera phone. So if it's just for personal use and you're filming yourself, it should be okay. But if you should publish it in a movie, then you would have to ask the people in the footage for permission. But of course, if you do something in a public space and just observe people, then you can write your observations. But if you do anything, if you just, for example, you're an anthropologist and you go to a village and you try to see how this tribe works, what they do in everyday life, you can ask for permission, but you can also just observe. If they accept you in village, you can write about their way of life. If they accept you in their culture, you're just a free person doing their own thing. But if you're going to use anything that would be personal or sensitive information, then it's different. Also, if you go like, for example, to a public square and just observe, do people walk through only to the green light, or do they try to run on the street in the red light? And you just observe how many people did that, then maybe you would not have to have informed consent from any of these persons, because you would not reveal any data about them, and you just observe it as any person could, not even a researcher. Anyone can do that. Just go on the street and and write something up. But if you want to publish this paper, then perhaps you would have, if they cross the street on the red light and you notice that, then you would have to have a person on the other side of the street, and he could ask the people, would it be okay if we mention that you crossed the red light in our paper? We would not report you to the police. We just want to do a research paper. Would it be okay? We would not mention your name or even ask your name. Would it be okay? So it can be done like this, but usually informed consent is not asked if you do it in a public space like that. But if you need to share, for example, if they did something unethical, or if they did something that would be very sensitive, then you would have to ask this person. For example, the best example is Candy Camera. If you do something like scare people on the street or something like that, and you want to publish it in a live television program or something like that, you would have to ask permission because they, that would be the best parallel to what you said, I think.
Excellent, Professor. I got a very, very nice advice. Thank you very much, because it was a problem that I always had about this informed consent. All the time we tell about informed consent. Thank you very much. You gave an excellent idea how to deal with that situation. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes. Is there any other questions or suggestions maybe?
Yep.
Or the comment?
Yeah. Or did you like something? Or did you not like something I said? You can have opinions.
Yes. Now this forum is open for you.
Hello.
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 Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Yes, I am Mahesh from the Open University. Your presentation is very important. Then I would like to thank to you and Madam Asha also. I have to clear some doubts regarding translation.
Mhm.
In research, we encounter a major problem in obtaining references in another language. For example, it is inappropriate to use English codes in research in Sinhala. There are various errors in translation there.
Yes.
The errors and then occur in research dissertation. This is not appropriate. No, sir. I think, but what can be done? This is because such usage does not exist in the Sinhala language. There are also translators' ideas in some translations.
Yep.
I think we, as a researcher, I face that problem. How I catch that some quotations, some references from other language.
That's very true. So it depends on how, I don't know, but most research today, as you can see, we are talking in English now. So most of the world accepted English as the global language. So, and most published papers, especially those who are most valued, are in English, not in other languages. But yeah, I agree that knowing, and even the translators can translate something wrong. They can input some of their own thoughts into that. And even a small change in the sentence can influence how you, for example, even if the translator did everything right, but just missed one word, and the word can be like completely change the meaning of the sentence, like from something positive to something negative, if they just remove the word no. So it's very dangerous. And I think that researchers should really know English, at least, very good. And also maybe at least one or two more languages. For example, in Serbia, in middle school, we learned 3 or 4 languages, including Latin. So we have to know a lot of languages. But yeah, I don't know if in other cultures is, I don't know in Sri Lanka how many, but usually I think that maybe you learn English. But what's most important is that the translators should really be, maybe usually we do it like this. When we translate, for example, an instrument from English to Serbian, or from French, or from Russian, or from Spanish, we usually use 3 translators, and then we see how much of the thing what they translated is the same. And if they translated it differently, then we have a problem, and we use more translators. So we check by tripling the translators. So for example, if they all translated the same, then probably it's the same meaning, and probably it wasn't a mistake. But you can always like when I talked about the limitation of a study, every time you translate something, you can always say, I use translators and I did the translation in the best of my ability, but if something was wrong, it was only by mistake. So you can just, it's usually not written in papers, but maybe in a master thesis, a student could say that if something was done improperly by accident, it's not on purpose, and maybe something was translated wrong, especially because students maybe have less knowledge about English or other languages. I don't know. I'm not really sure, but yeah, we use more translators than one, and then we solve the problem like that. So if they converge and they have the same translation, then we probably assume that the translation is well. Also, we can also check by ourselves, usually because all researchers in Serbia know English at least. We can usually check if the translation was good or the translator did something wrong. So we can check about that. But other languages are really an issue. I don't know how I would do if I had like Sri Lankan or, for example, Thailand, those letters that are so strange. And yeah, I wouldn't know what to do with that. So I would have to trust the translators. I would not have a choice.
Yes. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. I will follow your instruction. Right. Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Thank you, madam.
have more than one translator. I know it's more expensive, but it's the best way.
Yeah. Yes. I know that.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, because I want to tell you, because the research ethics within the psychology is very vast. But from beginning up to end, you summarize a vast area for just for 1 hour. And thank you very much, sir. And the other thing is, I want to tell you, in for the Sri Lankan culture, we actually we are now implementing the ethical practices for our research. Very recently, we have set up under the postgraduate studies, the Faculty of Postgraduate Studies in University of Jayewardenepura, to evaluate the ethical. We established an ethical committee for evaluate the humanities and social sciences research. So for us a bit new. That might be some of my students are still taking time to study that. And thank you very much for your presentation. And I really hope with you to make another discussion about the ethics in psychotherapy.
Yeah, that's my main
hopefully
field.
Yes,
So.
hopefully in future. And then as well, after, I hope, hopefully after settle down this corona pandemic situation, to welcome you to Sri Lanka, and for my university itself, or we can have a very good program in the future. And
Yes.
thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Madam.
Yes. Do you have any other?
And thank you for madam and you. And then sir, professor, and thank you very much. Can I have these slides, please? How can I have these slides, or I mean the lecture slides, or some recordings or something like that?
Yeah, I think professor will mail to me, so I will share with our website.
Outside, how can I have those? I can personally request from Dr. Asha. From you, right, madam? Isn't it?
Yeah. And even I hope to display it in the video. I will get the record, and all I will display in the CDEPD, Center for Digital Education. Yeah.
Get some more.
Yeah, and even I will share after uploaded all. I will share with all.
Thank you.
Share with all.
Thank you very
much. Thank you.
Okay. I also shared my email, but yeah, I will send everything to Professor Ash.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
And you can use it if you want to share this knowledge. Please share it. I won't mind. I won't mind at all.
Thank you very much again. Okay.
If you want to write anything, you can drop to the professor.
Right.
Even he has mentioned his email address. You can trace from that.
I can do this.
Yeah, if you have an ethical dilemma during your life, please remember my email and talk to me.
Yeah, sure, sir.
Thank you so much, actually.
Okay, thank you all for participating, and thank you all for your attention. And thank you, Professor Asha, for inviting me. You are very, very kind.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.